Welcome back to Federal Insights, Protecting the Federal Supply Chain, sponsored by Infor on Federal News Network. My guest today is Christine Barnhart. She's the Senior Director at Infor for Supply Chain Strategy, and I'm your moderator, Scott Maucione. So we've been talking about all the importance of supply chain and the government's response to this. And part of the government's response came from what we saw during COVID. What happened during COVID that we really needed to put an effort into this? And how did we get to that point where we were, where it was a little scary at times? While, for some of us didn't have toilet paper, other times the government didn't have the things that it needed, or companies didn't have the things that they needed to produce.
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to understand that unlike other professions like engineering or accounting, being a doctor, supply chain's relatively young. Really kind of started to be talked about in the 60s, kind of grew up in the 70s and 80s. And the supply chains and the technology really that we were utilizing at the start of the pandemic really hadn't changed that much in the last 20 or so years. And those supply chains, when they were built originally, were very regionalized. They were very domestic. Obviously, in the 90s and the 2000s, we really started to expand supply chains globally. And even, over the previous 10 or 15 years, we've seen disruptions in supply chain. But I think we always thought, it was kind of a one-time thing. It was a black swan, right? There was a hurricane or flooding, or maybe a government destabilization issue. This is really the first time since the Spanish influenza epidemic that we've had some type of a catastrophe that has really hit the whole world. And what it really did was highlight how fragile supply chains were. They were kind of on a bit of a shoestring, to be honest, and we just fell off the cliff. And unfortunately, now that that's happened, it will take a pretty significant period of time to really resync supply chains. And a lot of people I know question that. What does that mean? So it's not that a company can't still manufacture a component or a product, but if they can't get the raw material or the components that go into that product, they're kind of stuck waiting. And we've seen that right now with the chip shortages in automotive, right? And what's causing that? Well, we had a fire and facility burnt down, but even if those materials were available, getting them into the United States is a bit of a problem right now because the supply chain is out of sync. It really depended on a predictable flow of goods and containers in and out of the country, and all of that is out of sync. A big indicator of that is just looking off the coast of California, and you see all of the large, ocean vessels waiting. They're just waiting to come in to be offloaded. I think it's further really exacerbated by not so much a shortage of truck drivers, but the retention, right? So we're seeing people aren't staying in over the road trucking as a field. There's a number of causes for that. I think it's an area where we as a country are going to have to take a hard look moving forward. And I'm very hopeful that some of the infrastructure dollars that are moving through the system will really help with that. But everything is a bit out of sync. We were already operating on a bit of a shoestring. And we need a couple of things to happen to move forward. So it's really scary. I think the good part is just noticing, yes, there's been slowdowns, there's been disruptions, but ultimately you still have the things that you need, right? Yes, toilet paper was short for a little while, but I didn't see people outside cutting down trees and using leaves, right? So it was uncomfortable, it was anxious, but it wasn't really a catastrophe per se. And so I think that's a good thing that should really make us all feel a little bit better about, hey, you know what, we're resilient as a people, we can overcome these challenges. I think the other thing that should make people feel better is there are technology solutions to help. Companies that had already made investments in supplier collaboration and assurance of supply, companies that had already made investments in real-time visibility, they fared better during the pandemic. We have a lot of evidence to that effect. They fared better because they saw that there was a stoppage or a slowdown days, maybe even weeks before others in their industry. And so they were able to take action. They fared better because they had these, very cooperative and collaborative relationships with their suppliers that allowed them to make changes and adjustments. So one of the things that I have been, kind of talking about recently, and I lived through the outsourcing in the 90s and the 2000s because I was at Whirlpool, right? Anything that we didn't feel like was core to our business, we outsourced. We saw a lot of problems with that, actually, right? We only thought about the cost of the material itself, and we weren't really considering quality and lead time and all these other things. And I really feel like COVID put a huge spotlight on that. So companies that were more vertically integrated, or companies that had what I consider to be kind of a virtual vertical integration, meaning they have a tool that connects them and their suppliers. They exchange forecasts, they exchange capacity requirements, they exchange orders. They fared better. And that's because they were able to, get those suppliers on the phone and say, hey, I want to slow this down. I want to speed this up. So I think, all is not lost. We've learned a ton. I know it's been painful for a lot of individuals, but I truly believe when we all work together, we're pretty ingenious individuals, and we really will build back better.
It was a really interesting dynamic going through that really COVID time, and that we're still going through, because it sort of turned a lot of the capitalistic sort of tenets upside down. The supply of things was really high in some areas, and there was no demand, while there was a ton of demand in some areas and no supply. And then,
Right.
obviously you're talking about also, we had expanded this globalization a lot, and now maybe things need to be hemmed in at times to stay within the United States. So, are people thinking about those sorts of things at this point, and how we're moving forward with that?
I think absolutely. I mean, I've seen a ton of companies looking at maybe not completely onshoring, but nearshoring. So bringing their supply chains a little closer to the point of consumption. We've seen, a ton of activity, like I said, in supplier management, supplier collaboration tools. And then I think the other big area is really around the demand side, demand planning, demand sensing. The demand patterns of the past have been just completely kind of thrown out the window. Much of the demand that we saw during COVID, people just were not predicting, right? And so we're now seeing, okay, we have artificial intelligence, we have machine learning. Why aren't we using it more? A lot of companies are asking themselves that, or how could we apply this better so that, we're able to see these changes in the market, instantaneously or nearly instantaneously.
You brought up a really great thing I wanted to go up to next, which was machine learning and artificial intelligence. The Army, which we talked to last week, they talked about really how they've been investing in centers of excellence for things like 3D printing, for additive manufacturing, and also for AI and those sorts of things. What did those sorts of technologies do for the supply chain and for that onshoring as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of impacts there. So if we kind of break this up and we think about, 3D printing, it does a couple of things for private supply chains. One is it can reduce inventory. Why do I need to keep this potential part that I'm going to need for my manufacturing on the shelf? I can print it when I need it. So that's one thing, is just, it really helps us in terms of the bottom line. But the other thing that it can really do is help us pivot and shift very quickly. Hard tooling takes a long time to kind of go through the design and the build and the testing phase, where with 3D printing and additive manufacturing, I can turn things around very quickly. We've seen great adoption in terms of, kind of the design and the development side of the private sector, we are, continuing to see improvements in terms of actually leveraging that either in, high-speed production, maybe maintenance, MRO, capital, things of that nature. But I think COVID has, again, really shown, okay, there's a need for this. We may not be the Jetsons, it may not be everything at our house, but there's a place for 3D printing and additive manufacturing. And, I was really fortunate in 2015 or so to do some work with the Department of Defense, where we were looking at, how do we set up these centers of excellence and how do we leverage them? So I really feel like on the public side, they've been a bit of a trailblazer. They've been leading the way, and which is great because that's really what we need, right? We need those use cases that show the benefit, that show either how much quicker we were able to satisfy a need or how much less expensive it was because we weren't carrying excess inventory. And those use cases are then really, held on to by private businesses, and they help inform us and build out use cases and ROI so that businesses make those investments.
Well, very interesting topic, a lot to discuss in the future, a lot going on. I'd like to thank my guest today. Her name is Christine Barnhart, the Senior Director at Infor for Supply Chain Strategy. I'm your moderator, Scott Massioni, and you're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Infor.